I never expected a dinner party to be the moment everything changed. But looking back now, I think some things have to break wide open before they can finally heal. My name is Margaret. I'm 64 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been a widow. My husband, Robert, passed away in the spring of 2021. A heart attack, very sudden, very cruel in its speed. One Tuesday morning, he was drinking coffee at the kitchen table in our home in Burlington, Ontario, making fun of the weather forecast the way he always did, and by Thursday he was gone. 41 years of marriage, and suddenly I was alone in a house that had 4 bedrooms and only one person sleeping in it. I want you to understand that I'm not someone who falls apart easily. I was a French immersion teacher for 32 years at an elementary school in Halton. I raised my son, Thomas, through chicken pox and broken bones and the awkward silence of teenage years. I drove through ice storms, I filed my own taxes. I once fixed a burst pipe at 2 a.m. with nothing but a YouTube video and some plumber's tape. I am, by nature, a capable person. But grief has a way of making you feel like a stranger in your own life, and I'll be honest, in those first months after Robert died, I leaned on Thomas more than I should have. I called too often. I showed up at his house in Oakville sometimes without calling ahead. I thought I was being helpful. I brought casseroles. I offered to take their daughter, little Penny, to her skating lessons on Saturday mornings so that Thomas and his wife could have some time together. I thought I was being a good mother, a good grandmother. I thought that was what family did. His wife's name is Claire. She's 36, works in pharmaceutical sales, very polished, very organized. She keeps a color-coded calendar on the refrigerator, and her pantry is arranged alphabetically. I say that without judgment, truly. Claire is efficient in a way I've always admired, even when it made me feel slightly chaotic by comparison. She grew up in Calgary, came east for university, met Thomas at a conference in Toronto, and they married in 2016 inches, a beautiful ceremony at a vineyard in Niagara-on-the-Lake. Claire and I were never close, but we were, I thought, respectful, cordial. We shared Christmases and Thanksgivings and birthday dinners without incident. She called me Margaret, never Mom, which I understood. I never pushed for more than she was willing to give. After Robert died, I noticed a shift. Small things at first. A certain tightness around Claire's eyes when I arrived at the house. A pause before she opened the door that felt just a fraction too long. Thomas would call me on his way home from work sometimes, and I could hear in his voice that he was choosing his words carefully, that particular gentle vagueness that told me the conversation had already happened in another room without me. I told myself I was imagining things. That grief was making me paranoid. That Claire was simply a private person, and I was projecting my loneliness onto ordinary moments. I kept showing up. I kept bringing casseroles. It was Thomas who told me, last September, about the dinner. He called on a Wednesday evening, voice bright with excitement. He'd just closed a significant contract at the engineering firm, where he worked a major partnership with a Japanese infrastructure company, Matsuda Group, who were expanding into the Canadian market. The lead executives, Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Meters, and a lead executives, Yoshida, were flying in from Osaka the following Friday to sign the papers and celebrate. The firm was hosting a dinner at a restaurant in downtown Toronto, and spouses were invited. I thought, Thomas said, and I could hear him smiling, that it might be nice if you came too, Mum. Mr. Tanaka actually asked about family during one of our video calls. He talked about how much he values the idea of multi-generational relationships in business. I think having you there would make a good impression. I was surprised, touched. Are you sure Claire won't mind? I asked. Of course not, he said. It'll be great. I should tell you something I hadn't mentioned to Thomas or Claire in years, because it simply never came up. When I was teaching French immersion, our school had a sister school exchange program. In 1998, we partnered with a school in Kyoto, Japan, and for 2 school years I worked alongside a Japanese teacher named Hiroko, who was doing a teaching fellowship in Ontario. We became genuine friends. She taught me Japanese the way friends teach each other languages at kitchen tables. Over tea, through laughter and embarrassing mistakes. I studied seriously for those 2 years, continued on my own for several years after, and later took formal courses at a community college in Hamilton. I'm not fluent. Not perfectly, my reading is better than my speaking, but I can follow a conversation without difficulty, and I can hold my own in one if given a moment to find my footing. It's not something I advertised. It wasn't relevant to my life in Burlington, and people always seemed more surprised than they needed to be when a 60-something retired French teacher said she also spoke Japanese. So I'd stopped mentioning it. It had simply become a quiet part of me, like knowing how to read music or bake proper croissants. I didn't think about it when Thomas invited me to that dinner. I wore my navy dress. The one Robert always said made me look like I was about to chair a board meeting, which he meant as a compliment. I drove to the restaurant, a quiet, elegant place near King Street West, and met Thomas at the door. He hugged me and said I looked wonderful. Claire arrived 2 minutes later in a black blazer, her hair perfectly straight. She kissed my cheek and said, "Margaret, lovely you could make it," and smiled in that way that is technically a smile. Mr. Tanaka and Mr. Yoshida were already at the table with their colleague, a younger man named Kenji who served as their interpreter. They stood when we approached, bowed, and presented business cards with both hands. I received mine with both hands and a small bow, and Mr. Tanaka looked at me with a flicker of pleasant surprise. The dinner began beautifully. Thomas was relaxed and funny, translating the technical achievements of the project into language that felt celebratory rather than clinical. Mr. Tanaka was warm, curious, asked questions about Ontario, about our winters, about whether Burlington was near Niagara Falls. I answered when spoken to, and mostly I listened. Kenji was good at his job, but interpretation has natural gaps and pauses. At one point, while Kenji was speaking quietly to Mr. Yoshida, Mr. Tanaka turned to Claire and said something in Japanese. He was gesturing gently toward me with one hand. He said in Japanese, "Your mother-in-law, she has very calm, dignified energy, like someone who has lived a full life with grace." I understood every word. I kept my face pleasantly neutral and took a sip of my water. Claire laughed lightly and glanced at me with an expression that I recognized, the expression of someone who assumes a translation is not coming. And then she replied, in Japanese. Halting, imperfect Japanese, she must have studied some, perhaps a phrasebook preparation for the dinner, enough to attempt a simple response. She said, mixing Japanese and English in the way beginners do. She is very present. She comes to our house very often. It is sometimes difficult. Mr. Tanaka nodded politely. He said, still in Japanese, "Ah, mothers can be lonely after loss." And Claire said, low, almost casual in English now, clearly assuming I couldn't follow. She lost her husband 3 years ago. Since then, she's at our door every other week. Thomas doesn't want to say anything because she's his mother. But it's a lot. She doesn't really have her own life anymore. I think she just doesn't know what to do with herself. There was a pause at the table, a small silence that only I felt the full weight of. I don't know what to do with myself. I set my water glass down very carefully. My hands were steady. I have spent a long time in classrooms, and classrooms teach you to keep your face calm when something hits you somewhere deep. I breathed in slowly. I looked at the candle in the center of the table. Thomas hadn't heard he'd been leaning over toward Mr. Yoshida, looking at something on a phone. He looked up then and smiled at me. I smiled back. Mr. Tanaka was watching Claire with a polite, unreadable expression. And then, perhaps because he was a gracious man, perhaps because he sensed something I wasn't showing, he turned to me directly. He said, in Japanese, "Do you enjoy the autumn in Ontario?" And I answered him. In Japanese, I said, "Very much. I find it is the season that reminds us most clearly that things change, and that change can still be beautiful." The table went very quiet. Mr. Tanaka blinked. Then his face opened into the most genuine, delighted smile I'd seen all evening. He said in Japanese, "You speak Japanese?" I said, "A little. I had a dear friend from Kyoto. She was very patient with me." He laughed a real laugh, warm and surprised. He said something to Mr. Yoshida, and Mr. Yoshida laughed too. Kenji was grinning. Thomas looked between us, confused and smiling. "Mum, you wait, what?" I said in English calmly. "I studied a little Japanese years ago. I should have mentioned it before the dinner. I'm sorry, it must have seemed rude to have kept quiet." I did not look at Claire. But I could see her, at the edge of my vision. The color had drained from her face. "Mr. Tanaka spent the rest of the dinner asking me about my time teaching, about Hiroko, about the sister school exchange. He was genuinely engaged in a way that had shifted from business courtesy to something more personal. At one point he said, to Thomas, in careful English, "Your mother is remarkable, you are lucky." Thomas looked at me across the table with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was young, something open and wondering. He said quietly, "Yeah, I know." We said our goodbyes on the sidewalk after. The executives shook hands warmly. Mr. Tanaka bowed to me and said in Japanese that he hoped we would meet again. I said I hoped so too. Thomas hugged me and said, "Mum, why didn't you ever tell me you spoke Japanese? That was incredible." He was laughing, shaking his head. I said, "It never came up." Claire stood slightly apart from us. When Thomas turned to hail a cab, she stepped toward me. Her voice was very low. She said, "Margaret, I looked at her, not unkindly, but directly. She stopped, tried again. "I didn't know you could understand." "I know," I said. "I'm sorry. What I said, I didn't mean it the way it sounded." I stood there on that Toronto sidewalk in my navy dress, and I thought about 32 years of teaching other people's children to be brave enough to speak in another language, about 41 years of a marriage that taught me patience was not weakness, about 3 years of grief that I had tried very hard not to make anyone else carry. I said, "Claire, I know that I've been at your door more than you wanted. I know I haven't always read the room. That's something I can work on. But I need you to know something. I'm not there because I don't have a life. I'm there because he's my son, and because that little girl is my granddaughter, and because some mornings that house in Burlington is very quiet." Claire's eyes were bright. She pressed her lips together. "I'm not your problem to manage," I said. "I'm your family." Thomas had turned back. He'd heard the last part. He looked between us, and then he walked to me and put his arm around my shoulders, and he said, "You are absolutely our family, Mum." He looked at Claire. Something passed between them, the private language of a marriage, and then she nodded. A small nod, but a real one. We stood there for a moment, the three of us on the sidewalk with the October wind coming off the lake, taxis moving past, the city doing what cities do. Thomas called the following Tuesday. He asked if I'd like to come for dinner on Saturday. Penny had been asking about me, apparently. She wanted to show me something she'd learned at skating. I said I'd bring dessert. He laughed and said I didn't have to bring anything. I brought butter tarts because they're his favorite and have been since he was 8 years old. Claire met me at the door. She opened it before I knocked, which she had never done before. She looked at me for a moment and then said quietly, "I've been thinking about what you said. A lot." I said, "So have I." She stepped back to let me in, and I went inside. I won't tell you that everything is perfectly healed, because that would be tidy in a way that real life rarely is. Families don't repair themselves in a single evening. There are still moments when I feel that familiar tightness, when I second-guess a phone call, when I wonder if I'm reading the room correctly. Growth is not a straight line, not at 64, not at 36, not at any age. But last month, Claire texted me on a Thursday afternoon with no occasion at all. She sent me a photo of a recipe, some Japanese milk bread she'd found online. She wrote, "Thought of you. Have you ever made this?" I hadn't. I told her I hadn't. I told her it looked complicated and wonderful. She wrote back, "Want to try together sometime?" I wrote, "Very much," and I meant it. If you are watching this and you have ever felt like a burden, like you were too present, too needy, too much, I want to say this clearly. Needing connection is not a character flaw. Grief is not a personal failing. Wanting to be part of the lives of the people you love is not something you should have to apologize for. And if you are watching this, and you are the Claire in someone's story, I want to say this gently. The person at your door is not an obstacle. She is a woman who has buried her husband, who gets up every morning in a quiet house, who brings casseroles because it is the only language she knows for "I love you and I'm frightened." She deserves your patience. She deserves your honesty. She deserves a seat at the table, not just when it's useful, but because she belongs there. We are not burdens. We are the ones who came before. We are the ones still here. And sometimes, if you're patient, if everyone is patient, a quiet dinner in an unexpected language is exactly enough to begin again.